major sources of like get out of jail free cards, right? They've got no breakthrough AI technology. Their AI, their energy infrastructure is basically now, hedged to U.S. liquid natural gas. They have these, much more and turn themselves right into, with high education, relatively large population, good geographic position. In principle, they could make that work, right? But all these things sort of went the wrong way for them, right? China, instead of being like a trade partner for them, is like actively trying to undermine most of their strategic industries.
Hey freaks, today we're featuring Matt Pines, a strategic thinker who really understands the complex systems at play with Bitcoin and global finance. Matt breaks down Europe's struggles, especially around energy and politics, and how they affect its standing in a world increasingly dominated by the US and China. In this video, he'll talk about why Europe's integration plan is facing big hurdles, how Europe's energy dependency and fractured politics are weakening its global position, and why the euro's challenges might just be a symptom of deeper structural issues. You'll also hear about how the US might be positioned to use this situation to its advantage. Stick around for the full discussion. Find the link to the podcast in the description. If you enjoy this breakdown, hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated with the latest from the TFTC podcast. Coming up, Matt explains why Europe's grand experiment with a unified currency and political system is showing serious cracks.
I think the ECB, though, represents the interests of Europe from a certain perspective, right, which has been pushing a much more federalized vision of the European political system, which is premised on kind of a common economic, integrated market and a currency union. And so the nature of the currency has been a critical pillar of supporting this sort of geopolitical vision, right? Trying to integrate the continent, recognizing that it has very fractious and divergent local cultures, historical enmities, et cetera. So they're much more politically sensitive to anything that could threaten the integrity of the euro as a political project, right? It's much more a political form of money. It's relatively recent, in history. And it's fragile in the sense that it doesn't really span an integrated, say, military system or a geopolitical bloc that can stand as President Macron was sort of pushing before the Russia invasion of Ukraine as sort of a strategic autonomous system that can sort of calibrate on its own terms against increasing what is a bipolar system, the US and China.
All right. Let me break this down in simple terms. Matt is explaining that Europe tried to create something really ambitious. Imagine trying to get 27 different countries, each with their own way of doing things, to use the same money and follow the same rules. The euro, their shared currency, wasn't just about making it easier to buy things across borders. It was about trying to unite Europe into one powerful bloc that could stand up to giants like the United States and China. But here's the problem. While they share a currency, they don't share an army or truly unified government, and this makes the whole system fragile, kind of like building a house without proper foundations. President Macron of France wanted Europe to become more independent and powerful on the world stage, but that dream is looking increasingly difficult to achieve. Up next, Matt reveals why Europe's carefully laid plans are falling apart. In this next segment, Matt explains why Europe's position in the world is getting weaker by the day. Pay attention to how seemingly separate problems are creating a perfect storm.
They're really have no major sources of like get out of jail free cards, right? They've got no breakthrough AI technology. Their energy infrastructure is basically now, hedged to U.S. liquid natural gas. They have these, much more fractious internal political disputes and divergences across the continent, and it's just not great for them, right? And so I think my last part of that post was like, the whispers going out, right, to the elite who always get the heads up before, big changes happen, is that, they're going to eventually, maybe sooner rather than later, have to do something a little bit more dramatic, try to keep the project stabilized. And that, will likely go in a direction that has usually gone in many similar cases of, financial repression and capital controls, right? Is that, the whole point is to try to keep people in, right? And the game of being a good technocrat is to try to engineer those capital controls and that financial oppression in such a way that doesn't obviously appear to be that's what it is, right? And so there's different, maybe more technocratic ways to kind of do that on the margin through the banking system, through more obscure kind of technical mechanisms. But those only get you so far. And if you do hit a major speed bump, like another major shock, then those sorts of halfway measures aren't going to be sufficient. And so I think there's been discussions, right? You saw the Draghi sort of paper, right? The sort of he's like the king technocrat for Europe, and he was sort of told, like, go off into the research cellar with a few of your trusted lieutenants and come up with like a master plan for Europe to like fix Europe. And he came out with this long document, and he basically said, right, like, Europe is hosed unless we make some like major strategic changes. And it basically is sort of going down this route of increasing sort of consolidation of kind of the federal common debt sort of issuance, choosing sort of strategic sectors to invest in and letting others effectively die, like, really prioritizing across the continent where they have a marginal competitive advantage. So it's quite ambitious. It's kind of like the best shot they've got. And so, yeah, it's coming down from the top. That basically the writing's on the wall that, the way that Europe has sort of structured their geoeconomic position was premised on a whole bunch of things, relatively, stable external global trade, being able to calibrate between US and China in particular, while also preserving kind of this friendly relationship with their main energy source, in Russia, and turn themselves right into, with high education, relatively large population, good geographic position, in principle, they could make that work, right? But all these things sort of went the wrong way for them, right? China, instead of being like a trade partner for them, is like actively trying to undermine most of their strategic industries. They no longer have access to the cheap energy coming out of Russia. Their internal, political fractures have started to like manifest as a result.
This really gets to the heart of Europe's problems. Think of it like this. Europe had a plan that looked good on paper. They had educated workers, a large population, and a great location. They thought they could buy cheap energy from Russia, sell high-tech products to China, and maintain friendly relations with everyone. But everything that could go wrong did go wrong. Russia invaded Ukraine, cutting off that cheap energy. China, instead of being a good customer, started competing with Europe's best industries, and all the differences between European countries that were manageable in good times are becoming real problems in tough times. What you're about to hear might sound shocking. Matt reveals how the United States might use Europe's weakness to solve its own problems. And this gets to the heart of how global power really works.
There's even serious people coming up with plans that involve are essentially like forcing the European Union, the European members to like hand over their gold to the US in exchange for terming out, their debt holdings of US securities. As a way of essentially us, like, extracting more and more from what you call like the imperial periphery to sort of reinforce the strength of the core, right? And that in this global environment, you could look, simplify in the sense that, there's a massive great power competition, if not conflict, playing out between kind of Eurasian autocratic powers, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. And they're kind of, they're not necessarily like in a military alliance, but they're starting to like, directly support each other militarily, whether it's North Koreans sending troops and shells, China and Iran with drones and stuff, and kind of just like this reinforcing block around the Eurasian periphery to kind of push against the legacy kind of what you call like G7 system, and sort of G7 / like NATO system, and we're facing our own strategic challenges, right? Our own massive debt loads, our own domestic political issues, our own unsustainable fiscal trajectory. And if we ever hit a true problem, and we could be heading towards that soon, like, well, we're going to look around to see who we can essentially make eat that pain, right? And the political differential is that if you can make foreign populations and foreign governments eat that pain, instead of your own domestic citizens, well, that's what's going to happen, right? And so, that's what, if I was Europe, that's what I'd be worried about, right? Is that the U.S. can, whereas the Europeans can financially repress their citizens, the US can financially repress all of Europe.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack here. Matt is describing something that most people never hear about, how powerful countries deal with debt and financial problems. And here's what's happening. The United States has huge debts and financial challenges, but instead of making Americans feel the pain, there's talk of making Europe help pay the bill. Imagine if you owed money on a credit card. Instead of cutting back on spending, you find a way to make your neighbor pay part of your bill. That's basically what Matt is saying might happen to Europe. The U.S. could force European countries to trade their gold for longer-term U.S. debt, a move that helps America but hurts Europe. Stay tuned, because next we'll hear about why Europe's problems were predictable from the start. In our final clip about Europe, Matt explains the original plan for European unity and why hoping for time to fix everything might have been wishful thinking.
I mean, that's the thing. It's like for some definitions of long run, right? I think there was a hope that if they were able to kind of keep kicking any sort of major forced crisis or forced choice far enough down the road, that like eventually, almost by like acculturation and like generational turnover, that like it would sort of culturally reestablish a different set of assumptions in different populations as to like the inherent legitimacy of the sort of superstate institutions versus the national institutions. And it was essentially as like a project of almost like state construction, that like this thing called the European Commission and these sort of, supranational institutions like the ECB, have an inherent, issue with legitimacy given just how new they are. Right, like the Fed has been around for a while, and it's still people like think the Fed is like an illegitimate institution, but like it's basically accepted, right? It's like it ain't going anywhere, right? Like it's just an embedded piece of our institutional system. But like back in the 20s and 30s, like it probably wasn't, it was a much more up in the air thing. If you look at like old debates in the House of Representatives, like do we really still need a Federal Reserve? Like what was the original purpose of it, right? So at a certain point, like, you could imagine that just like time eventually,
the Lindy effect kicked in.
Yeah, sort of things eventually that start off fragile and sort of have relatively more loose anchors of legitimacy, right? Just by virtue of surviving long enough, that kind of.
This really helps us understand what European leaders were thinking. Their big idea was simple but ambitious. If they could just keep things together long enough, younger generations would grow up seeing the European Union as normal and natural, just like Americans today see the Federal Reserve as a normal part of life. Think about it like this. If you're born after the euro was created, you might not question it the same way your grandparents did. European leaders hoped that time would make their new system feel more legitimate and permanent. It's like how kids today don't question using smartphones, while older folks remember a world without them. But as we've heard throughout these clips, reality isn't cooperating with this plan. Europe's challenges aren't giving them the time they need for this generational change to take hold. The question now is whether their experiment in unity can survive these pressures, or if we're watching the slow unraveling of one of the most ambitious political projects in history. So that's a wrap on Europe's challenges, from their internal tensions to their growing dependence on external energy sources and competitive pressures. We looked at how this all connects to the euro and Europe's position in a world of shifting powers. This episode came from the TFTC podcast. Check the link in the description for the full episode. Now, here's a question for you. What do you think Europe's next steps should be in strengthening their position on the global stage? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and remember to like, subscribe, and thanks for watching.